All right, nerds. I am here with Shervin Aazami, who's running in California's 32nd district. We actually invited all of the candidates who have been registered to be on the ballot to come join us for a long form conversation. I said, hey, look, I'll ask you why you're running, what issues are important to you, how you would have voted on some things, how you're going to measure success, and I'll give you, as much time as you want to talk, and we'll have a really thoughtful conversation. But I will ask follow-up questions, and it'll be a dialogue. And Shervin was the only one so far. I don't know. Everybody who all campaigns were invited by email, phone, and social media. And we did send them the join link, so maybe one of them will show up. And actually, I will say that someone from Melissa Toomim's campaign did accept the invitation, so hope maybe she'll be joining us shortly. But want to first welcome Shervin. Hello, nerds.
Hello, nerds. Thanks for having me back, Tom. Great to be here.
Yeah, this is an interesting kind of, there's like a meta conversation about a conversation in that I have been trying to get CA32 folks, in a conversation for a while,
Yep.
unsuccessfully. I know we've been able to get you on the show, but I haven't been able to get anybody else, including Aarika Rhodes, who has been on the show before
Right.
she uh, actually I think before you came on the show,
Mm-hmm.
and we just have not been able to get anybody else to come back on, and it's a bummer because I noticed that many of the candidates were complaining that Brad Sherman doesn't make himself available. And so I was like, all right, well, let's have a conversation without Brad. Let's just everybody except Brad, we can talk. And there's definitely like it's been difficult. I don't know, maybe everybody's schedule has been really hard. I've offered many times to reschedule, but
Yep.
here we are. I mean, what do you think? I mean, you're a busy guy. You're running a campaign. I get it. You can't accept every invitation. How do you feel like the voters of CA32, like, do you feel like they've had enough of an opportunity to see the candidates together and in kind of long form discussions?
Well, I will say, starting first with what our campaign has done to engage voters. We've held multiple forums on important issues, including on housing, on climate, on healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
We held a town hall last week. We've held multiple discussions in people's driveways and their living rooms over
Mm-hmm.
Zoom. We've really tried to find as many opportunities as possible to engage voters. And one of the additional ways that we've really hoped would happen before the primary was a forum or debate between all of the candidates for
Mm.
us to all make the case for why we're challenging Brad Sherman, what our
Mm-hmm.
vision is, what we bring to the table, what we're fighting for.
Yeah.
Our campaign has made it clear from the very beginning that we think that it's in the best interest of our voters to be able to make informed decisions by hearing directly from their candidates about who they are and what they're fighting for. I would hope, to your point, that every candidate, especially those that have been very clearly attacking Brad for his absence, would take advantage of opportunities to make their case. I've tried locally on many different occasions, including just like you, going on social media and tagging the other candidates saying,
Mm.
can we please have a debate? And it's been radio silence. Unfortunately, up until this point, there's only been one debate that was held in our district. It was held by the San Fernando Valley and Santa Monica Mountains chapters of the Progressive Democrats of America. It was a debate
Mm-hmm.
they held between Aarika Rhodes and myself. No other candidates were part of that, but they used that debate to make a decision about which one of us to endorse. I'm happy to say we earned the endorsement, but that was really it. That was the only time that voters were able to hear from more than one candidate at once. And it's really unfortunate because, Brad Sherman, he's failed our constituency over and over again, in his 26 years in office. We'll get into it a little bit later, but, I'm proud to say that when I was a legislative advocate on Capitol Hill, when I was director of congressional relations for the only national indigenous healthcare nonprofit, I pushed through more bills in 2 years as an advocate in that role as director than Brad Sherman has accomplished in 26 years as a legislator. I mean, one of the 2 bills he's passed was a name change to a post office in our district. I mean, that's not meeting the needs, whether it's around affordable housing and ending homelessness, whether it's around healthcare, around immigration reform, around climate justice, around economic issues, and so much more. We just think it's really important for voters to have ample opportunity to hear directly from all of us. We'll continue to do that. And that's why I'm on your show, and very honored and very grateful to you for really continuing to hold us accountable, to say, look, get on my show, take advantage of this opportunity to make your case. And we'll just never stop doing that.
Yeah, well, if folks are watching this either live or on replay, and you're like, hey, my candidate is not Shervin, it's someone else, and it's not fair that they didn't have any opportunities to be on the Nerd Show. Like, I'm happy to schedule one-on-ones with any of the candidates, and I've been trying to. But if people don't want to be in a group format, maybe they feel like, hey, it could get out of hand. Like, I'm happy to have one-on-ones, but I will ask a lot of questions, and I won't do anything gotcha, but I will give you a lot of airtime to make a case. So any rate, if I know June 7th is around the corner.
That it is.
And people deserve an opportunity to learn as much about these candidates as they can. And so we'll use that time tonight to get to know you, Shervin. Why don't we start off with, why are you running?
Yeah, I'm running because, again and again, the issues at the forefront of our district have gone unaddressed and have been totally thrown to the sidelines. Everything, like I said, from addressing homelessness, where we are ground zero for our humanitarian crisis of houselessness. Over 44,000 at the minimum. That's a huge underestimate. 44,000 unhoused in the city of LA, over 66,000 unhoused in the county. And roughly a fifth of those folks live here in our district, live in the San Fernando Valley. And the incumbent, Brad Sherman, has not introduced a single bill to address this crisis. I'm the son of 2 Iranian asylum seekers who fled religious persecution in Iran and settled here in the Valley to build a better life. And I always say I learned the power of responsibility from my mother and the power of service from my father. My mom working in retail 7 days a week when I was growing up, trying to make ends meet for the family, while my father went back to school to become a primary care physician. And, I've always fought for social justice through the lens of public health. Most recently, as I said, as legislative director on Capitol Hill, working on indigenous healthcare issues. And again, what I see is that here in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world, poverty is inherently a policy choice. We have a Congress that doesn't bat an eye to put over 52% of our annual discretionary budget into the military-industrial complex, while 8 out of 10 Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, while inflation is skyrocketing and it's hitting low-income, working-class, and middle-class families the hardest, while rent is unaffordable anywhere in America living on minimum wage, while 1 in 5 Americans are straddled with medical debt to the collective tune of $140 billion. There are literally more GoFundMe sites for a medical emergency than for, paying for your kid's birthday party. That should not be the case here in our country. And as we barrel towards climate catastrophe, what I see energy independence looking like is by investing in our own economy, in union-backed living wage jobs in renewable energy. What better way to establish an independence from despots and authoritarians the world over than by a Green New Deal right here at home? Let's utilize those that same infrastructure that we use to finance endless wars, namely the Defense Production Act, use that right here at home to scale renewable energy. We've already done an incredible job bringing down the cost of production for wind and solar to the point where it's cheaper than to produce coal, to produce oil and gas. Yet we're still not producing it at a scale. And Tom, you and I live here in the state of California, sunny California. Our state could be a net exporter of solar energy if we had the infrastructure and we're building it at scale, but we're not. And again, that's because of that corporate stranglehold from fossil fuel interest on our elected officials. And so what I believe we deserve here in a safely Democratic district that Biden won by nearly 40 points in the general election and that voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, there is no political downside to having an unapologetic advocate for the issues that matter. If we can't have it here, where else can we have it? And after 26 years of all these issues piling up, where our district is also ground zero for our climate crisis, we had the worst natural gas blowout in U.S. history happen right here. LA has the worst ozone pollution in the country. We have close to 1,000 abandoned oil wells, largely located in low-income communities of color, and they're leaking noxious chemicals like formaldehyde daily into our communities. Instead of closing those abandoned oil wells, instead of addressing that environmental racism, instead of building and electrifying public transit, as opposed to investing in more affordable housing, recognizing that here in the Valley, the median home price for a single family home is close to $1 million, which, I mean, if you're a nurse, if you're a teacher, if you're a sanitation worker, how can you afford that? I mean, LA already has a $15 minimum wage, but cost of living is so damn high, you got to be making over twice that amount to afford rent. And so more and more folks are being left behind. And I'm not hearing incumbents talk about these issues, and I'm not hearing them put forth real legislative solutions. Whereas you go on our website, you see detailed plans for how we would fight to address our housing shortage nationally, how we would fight to end criminalization of homelessness and actually invest in housing as a human right, how we would fight to rebuild our public health infrastructure and for single-payer Medicare for all, how we'd actually legislate on the vision of the Green New Deal, on immigration reform, on divesting from our endless wars, and so much more. You see detailed plans on our website. And we've been fighting for these things since day one. And so, again, it just boils down to we deserve real unapologetic advocates, because the issues before us, we don't lack the legislative solutions. We have so many experts, so many subject matter leaders that have said these are the solutions that work. What we lack is political courage, because it's driven by corporate greed. And so I'm proud to be the only candidate in this race who has actually signed pledges refusing corporate PAC money, signed pledges refusing donations from fossil fuel executives, from real estate developers, from executives in insurance and pharmaceutical companies, from the big weapons manufacturers. And, you know, there are other candidates who say they don't take special interest money. Well, then sign the pledges. There's no reason why, if you really don't take corporate PAC money, to not add your name, make it official in writing that you do not take money from corporate PACs or from special interests. But to this day, we are still the only campaign that's done so. So, you know, we are really implementing what that advocacy looks like every single day through our mutual aid efforts, through our town halls and our various ways of engaging the community. And, you know, I've been an activist my entire life, from not only on Capitol Hill, but here locally, working on food justice, working in climate justice, addressing the toxic impacts of urban runoff on local communities of color, to working for a residential treatment facility where I witnessed firsthand how our system criminalizes mental health, criminalizes substance use, and denies people the treatment that they deserve and need. These are the issues we are putting at the forefront of our campaign. And win or lose, I will never stop fighting for what matters, because I reject the savior complex. One person will not save the world. They will not solve all the problems. It's about carrying the movement forward. And that's what our campaign's rooted in.
So you started off talking about the housing crisis, and you mentioned that there are policies on your website. So let's take a look together at some of them. So maybe walk us through one of the specific proposals. If you stipulate that, hey, it's a huge problem, which I think many people would agree with, what would be something specifically that you think Congress could do, or that you could do if you were in Congress, that would make a dent in this issue? Fantastic
question. So the very first thing listed there, repealing the Fair Cloth Amendment. This is an austerity measure that's been on the books since Clinton's second term that has barred federal financing to construct any new public housing above their 1999 levels. In other words, we haven't had a dime from the feds to build new public housing this century. And so, for example, you look at I believe it was close to 140 billion that was outlined in the Build Back Better, now Build Back Never bill that's just died in Congress. There was 140 billion for housing. The lion's share of that money goes towards repair and maintenance costs for existing public housing. There was not a dollar to build new housing. Now, I want to make clear, it's very, very important that we rebuild and repair that existing public housing that's being struck with mold, lead poisoning. It's dilapidated. Those units need to be modernized and electrified as another way of reducing our emissions and making sure they run on renewable power. But in addition to that, we also need to build more housing. But Congress did not fix that problem in this piece of legislation. And so I think what a really big kind of mental switch that we need, and I've really learned this as a candidate running for federal office here in LA. Folks don't ask federal candidates about housing issues. I mean, in the minds of so many voters, it's seen as almost an exclusively state or local problem. And that's really allowed our federal officials to shirk responsibility when it comes to addressing housing. Even though, again, that federal austerity has shifted the burden to state and local governments that simply do not have the resources to really tackle this crisis without that federal support. I'll give you another example. President Biden, in his first week entering office, he authorized the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to provide local governments 100% federal reimbursement to shelter our unhoused in hotels for the duration of the pandemic. Recognizing, again, here in LA, we had thousands of unhoused Angelenos that died last year, either from the pandemic or from drug overdose deaths. And we've seen how it's disproportionately impacted our most vulnerable neighbors. The federal government was giving essentially free federal monies, the monies that have already been appropriated, down to local governments so they don't have to raise taxes one bit to be able to shelter folks. The city of LA never asked for that money. And not a single federal official said a word about it. Why? I mean, arguably, these folks played some role in pushing Biden to allow FEMA to do so. Well, then why not work with your city officials to make sure those federal resources are utilized? We were the only candidate that even brought it up. Just one example of how, again and again, our federal officials are really ducking and covering and not being held accountable for their role in addressing this crisis. And what's even more egregious is that the incumbent, Brad Sherman, chairs the very subcommittee with jurisdiction over our federal housing finance laws, over Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and over authorizing new affordable housing programs. He chairs the Investor Protection, Entrepreneurship, and Capital Markets Subcommittee. And since becoming chair of that subcommittee last Congress, BlackRock and Blackstone, the two Wall Street corporate landlords that were responsible for decimating our housing market, leading to skyrocketing costs, they were violating the eviction moratorium when it was in place. They started bankrolling his reelection campaign. Do you think he's introduced a single bill to address our housing crisis? We've been listening to his town halls for 2 years now, even more. I never hear him talking about homelessness, ever. That is a huge problem. And again, we're not going to be able to solve this crisis without our federal officials working hand in glove with state and local. And that's why we've really made a concerted effort to partner with state and local candidates and officials to say, look, we're all fighting for Medicare for all. How do we ensure the left hand, it's not another situation of the left hand not knowing what the right hand's doing? Let's really work together. Let's establish that solidarity, that camaraderie, so we can effectively solve these problems and stop working in silos. And so again, that's just one thing, repealing the Faircloth Amendment and really making the case to why we need to also make sure that our federal officials are working to address this crisis, pushing. I'll give you another example. Section 8, low-income housing tax credit. These are some of the biggest HUD programs for housing. You look at Section 8, it's lost funding when adjusted for inflation over the past decade. And we wonder why only 1 in 10 Angelenos who qualify for Section 8 receive services.
So Shervin, you've done a great job sort of listing out a lot of things that you have not seen done. And when you look at people that get to Congress, for whatever reason, they don't get a ton done. In a world where you could only focus on one thing, or you had to start somewhere, or you had to prioritize most of your time on one issue, what would it be?
If I were to narrow it down to 3 top priorities: housing, climate, and healthcare. And the way I see it, we cannot address either 3 when the lion's share of our discretionary resources are going towards the military-industrial complex. Starting with climate, the Pentagon has a larger carbon footprint than 140 countries. In the forever wars we've launched since 9/11, the Pentagon is responsible for emitting over 1,200 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. We are not going to be able to solve this crisis without divesting from the war machine and putting that money back into our communities for renewable energy, for electrifying public transit, for building new electric and renewable houses. Because again, our climate crisis is by far the most intersectional crisis we have. It impacts healthcare, as we see more and more rates of pollution, raging wildfires, storms, vector-borne illnesses. That's going to mean more chronic illnesses down the road. And so really, we got to work on addressing our climate crisis in tandem with guaranteed healthcare, because healthcare expenditures are going to increase as the climate crisis increases, and that leads to more and more health issues. And again, like I mentioned earlier, so many of these toxic sites, industrial power plants are intentionally located in low-income communities of color. And we see higher rates of asthma, higher rates of cancer, and so many other chronic illnesses located in those communities. And so we really cannot see these issues as separate. And so if I were to really focus on one thing, the one bill that I want to introduce when I'm in Congress, the very first bill is going to be taking from programs within the Pentagon that even the Pentagon has told Congress we no longer want, we no longer need. The F-35 fighter jet program is case in point. Congress appropriated more money for that program than the Pentagon even asked for. And so instead of just throwing more money at Raytheon and Lockheed Martin and Northrop Grumman, let's take those funds and put it in to addressing the chronic underfunding of our housing programs. Put it in to scaling renewable energy. Put it into single-payer Medicare for all. That's what I see us actually focusing on. And when it comes to healthcare expenditures, right now, we're already paying more than $4 trillion annually for healthcare here in the United States, despite the fact that we have so many people who are underinsured, uninsured, and not getting the resources they need. With single-payer Medicare for all, it would save us $2 trillion over the next 10 years compared to what we're spending now. Sure. Because go ahead. I can just keep going forever on these issues.
I know you're fired up, and I have good news. You're not alone in that great. We do have a second candidate from CA32 who has accepted our invitation for a conversation. Welcome, Melissa. How are you?
Hi, it's so nice to meet you, Tom.
Likewise.
Nice to meet you too, Shervin.
Yes, nice to meet you, Melissa. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Melissa, so the whole point of this is just to have an open-ended conversation. Ground rules are everybody's going to be respectful, assume positive intent.
Of course.
We all, might have differences of opinion, but like my job is just to kind of get to know people, and hopefully the audience can get to know each of you all, and those voting on June 7th will have more information to inform their decision. And since we've started off a little bit with Shervin, we'll shift gears a little bit and come back to you in a minute, Shervin. Melissa, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're running for office.
So my name is Melissa Toomim, and I have a background of 20 years of investigative journalism. primarily in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but also on lots of other issues. I did a little coverage of Ukraine back in 2014, but I don't really claim to be an expert on that field. I have a master's degree in nonproliferation and terrorism from the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. And I have my primary terrorism point of focus is the Muslim Brotherhood and their propaganda tactics, particularly in the US and Europe, and with some expertise in Sri Lanka, and a lot on Europe, a lot of what's going on there, more Western Europe than Eastern Europe at this time. That's a little bit. I'd like to make a little comment about Sherman's position on single payer.
Go for it. Sure.
So I used to be a big fan of what you're saying, but it became clear to me that single payer, the government, there's no accountability in that system. And competition is the key to accountability and making sure that there's not abuse. When you have just one authority, that to me is a recipe for abuse.
Shervin, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say that we already have that system. We have vast areas of land in this country where you only have one insurer or maximum two. Same thing with the pharmaceutical industry, where we've seen they've consolidated markets. Same thing with insurance. And people are paying more and more out of pocket. We do not live in a free market system. We call it free market, but it's actually socialism for the rich. These corporations control these systems. And they deny people the coverage that they deserve. They deny doctors to work with their patients to design what their treatment regimen should look like. They determine what costs they'll cover and what costs they won't. And they charge people so much out of pocket. And you're paying premiums and deductibles and paying for your prescription drugs. You're doing a copay when you go to see the doctor. And you're still not able to get that full coverage. And you're still having to set up a GoFundMe for your medical care. You know, my dad's a primary care physician. Every single day tells me he's tearing his hair out because he has to negotiate prior authorizations with the insurance companies to cover the cost of care for his patients. Where he's like, look, I'm trained in patient care, but the lion's share of my time is just yelling at insurance companies or pharmaceutical companies. So quite frankly, the system we currently have is not working. It's bankrupting the American people. We have a sick care system, not a healthcare system. And according to the CDC, over 90% of our healthcare expenditures are for preventable chronic conditions. The reason being, there's always more money to be made in treatment than there is in prevention.
So, Melissa, you mentioned that you're not convinced single payer is the right route because of the need for more competition.
Yes.
What would you do to improve, or do you think there's anything that should be done to improve the state of healthcare?
Well, I think making it a more open market is really the key. Competition is accountability. Competition brings down prices. And what I personally experienced in 2019 versus 2014, versus 2017. In 2017, my healthcare costs went down dramatically. My premiums went down. And that was when Trump took off the penalty for not joining the plans, right? And suddenly everything got cheaper. Everybody was competing for my business. And my monthly premium rate went from like $440 down to under $200. And then Gavin Newsom puts the penalty back on, and suddenly it shoots back up over $400. So competition clearly can bring down costs. That's just in my own personal experience.
Shervin, I'll let you respond, and then we'll move on to other topics.
I mean, the individual tax penalty, that mandate, I'm not sure what the relation to that is to competition. It's not like, by virtue of Trump eliminating the tax penalty, suddenly we had 4 new insurance companies offering coverage plans, right? So I don't really see how those two things are connected.
Tons of tons of companies were competing for my business. I mean, I was getting messages constantly of different.
So as an employer, then you're saying?
As an employer? No, as an individual. So it did create a more open market.
But the penalty
And
was on
putting
you,
the
not
penalty
on the
back on
insurers.
forced people into a situation where the insurance companies could coerce. It created a coercive situation. So that meant the insurance companies had more latitude to increase rates.
Look, I'm not making excuses for the insurance companies. I don't think that health insurance should exist. I think that healthcare is an inherent human right. And I think the way we reduce costs of healthcare is by guaranteeing coverage and making sure that doctors and patients decide what their treatment regimen looks like. And you have that comprehensive coverage for primary care, specialty care, maternal health care, postpartum care, geriatric care, pediatric care, and everything in between. And I think all the arguments that if we suddenly guarantee coverage, costs will skyrocket. Well, at the beginning, we might see some increased costs because all those people that historically have not had coverage now have it. But over time, we see it reduce. Why? Because when you have coverage in addition to access and you're utilizing that care more, you're seeing doctors more, they are catching any chronic illnesses much faster than, say, someone only going to the doctor for the first time when, God forbid, they have a late stage cancer or some other ailment. When you're seeing that care from the very beginning, including preventative care, over time, those costs go down. Because again, what I said earlier, treatment is always far more expensive than prevention. But the treatment is where the money is made, which is why we have a sick care system.
But when you only have one system, how do you avoid coercive care? I mean, I got a situation right now where, I get calls from the doctor's office saying, come in, come in, come in. I don't dare walk in because I don't want to take that shot. And they're going to try to coerce me into taking it. They're going to try to force me. There's so much coercion in the system right now for taking the shots. And there's actually a bill that was just voted on last week, and I don't remember what the outcome was, but this bill would penalize doctors who don't go along with the program. If a doctor wants to treat their patient, your dad, you want to treat your patients according to your own conscience, your own expertise, and you're not following the program, you could lose your license according to this bill. And if the government has full control, then how do you avoid that?
Single payer means the government pays for the care. It does not mean they dictate what the care looks like. Again, my point around Medicare for All is that the doctor, your doctor, and you as a patient decide what your care looks like, not the government. The government just covers the bill. That's what Medicare for All is. No copays, no deductibles, no premiums. And you and your doctor decide what the care looks like. Nobody else.
Sounds too good to be true.
It isn't too good to be true. I think, again, what we lack is that political courage to fight for it, because we have too many politicians that are bankrolled by the health insurance industry, by the private equity industry that now controls close to 20% of senior living facilities. And you look at them, they are cutting costs left and right, buying cheaper basic medical supplies, buying cheaper devices. We're seeing higher rates of deaths of our seniors in homes that are owned and operated by private equity firms. That's the problem, is that profit is the main driver of our healthcare system, not care. But when you have the government stepping in and just footing the bill, there's no longer that profit incentive. Instead, it's the doctor and the patient deciding what the care looks like. And again, the government foots the bill.
I'd like to switch it up a little bit and change topics. I know healthcare is a very complicated and people are super passionate about it. So I appreciate both of you sharing your respective points of view. I'd love to talk a little bit about foreign policy and maybe Ukraine for two reasons. One, Shervin, you referenced the military industrial complex, and Melissa, you talked about your experience in foreign policy and investigative journalism about that. Maybe we'll start with you, Melissa, since you've had less airtime so far. Tell me a little bit about, we've had multiple bills now where we are providing aid, military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. It seems like the war will continue for some time. How would you vote if you were in Congress when the next bill comes up where they say, some additional money for Ukraine?
Right. I don't think we can afford 40 billion for Ukraine. And I think that Europe needs to foot the majority of that bill. As far as what's actually happening on the ground, I feel nothing so much as I can't tell where the truth is.
Mm.
When the conflict started in March, I'm looking at images, an interview with a man who says he's standing next to his house that was bombed out last night. And I'm looking at that house and thinking, that looks like 30-year-old rubble at least. And then I see another image on TV of a city being bombed. And I'm like, that's not Ukraine. That's not Kiev. That's Gaza. I know what Gaza looks like. I've seen these images on TV, hundreds of times, right? So what I feel like we've been getting is a lot of political theater, and finding the truth in there is really, really difficult. I don't think we can afford it. And my position on Ukraine is really what I could have done to prevent it in the first place. Because if I were already in office in 2020, I would have been in President Trump's office jumping up and down and telling him not to appoint Zalmay Khalilzad as our envoy to the Taliban because, one, the Taliban are not in charge and you can't negotiate with lieutenants. You have to negotiate with the bosses, and the bosses are in Islamabad. And two, Zalmay Khalilzad worked for Islamabad. He made that clear in 2001 during the Bonn conference when he promoted Hamid Karzai as the interim president instead of bringing back the old president. So I would have prevented the appointment of the man who engineered the catastrophe in Afghanistan, and avoiding the catastrophe in Afghanistan would have prevented Putin from feeling emboldened to invade Ukraine.
Okay. Shervin, what's your take on Ukraine?
My take is that the focus should be humanitarian aid. The focus should be refugee resettlement. The focus should not be sending copious, if not endless amounts of military aid, and not even being concerned with or preventing those arms from falling in the hands of neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion. And I think what's clear to me is that when you actually look at the breakdown of that 40 billion and the various packages before it, because you can go on the House Appropriations Committee and they release a fact sheet showing line by line where the money is going. And the overwhelming majority of that aid is in the form of military weapons and munitions. A tiny fraction is actual humanitarian aid in the form of food, in the form of shelter, in the form of refugee resettlement. And again, when I hear our politicians actually say clearly what their goals are, Brad Sherman has done it, Adam Smith has done it, even Defense Secretary Austin has done it. When he was asked, Defense Secretary Austin, what our goal is, his response was a weakened Russia. Well, a weakened Russia is a very different goal than protecting the Ukrainian people and protecting human rights. Or when I hear Brad Sherman go on MSNBC and the anchor asks him point blank, what's our end game? His response, well, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, it took 10 years. He completely omits the fact that during that invasion, we supplied arms to the Mujahideen for 10 years in a proxy war with the Soviets. And by the time both the Soviets and the US, the two global superpowers at that time, departed Afghanistan, you had a political and economic vacuum that was ripe for extremism to fester. And of course, several years later, we had the Taliban.
Okay, so now this is very much in my wheelhouse.
If I may just finish my
Okay.
one quick point on this is that it seems clear to me our goal here is to not actually have a ceasefire or a diplomatic solution. I haven't even heard Biden use the word ceasefire regarding in Ukraine. That has not been our goal. It seems clear that our goal here is to ensnare the Russians in a long, drawn-out military quagmire to bankrupt the Russian economy. How does that serve human rights? And honestly, 40 billion. Now Ukraine is now the largest recipient of military aid, larger than Israel. While, again, like I said earlier, we have at least 500,000 people living on our streets in the United States, while inflation is skyrocketing and it's hitting our low-income families the hardest. Why are those not the issues we're responding to? Why are the investments not going there? Into housing, healthcare, education, clean air, and water, the actual things that keep us safe.
Thank you, Shervin. Melissa, you've been very respectful waiting to get in. Please.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I mean, I agree with Shervin a whole lot on Ukraine. I want to correct the record on Afghanistan. So the Mujahideen were actually really just the first generation of Pakistani proxies, and we were backing the Pakistani proxies in Afghanistan starting in the late 1970s. And with the goal of luring exactly the same situation, luring the Soviets at that time into a military quagmire. That was the 1979 goal. That was the memo that Zbigniew Brzezinski gave to Carter in July of 1979. If we pour more fuel on this fire, the Soviets will come in to put it out. And the Taliban were just the second generation of that. The Taliban, as I said before, they are not an Afghan movement. They were not spawned by the vacuum. They were the second generation who were being trained in the border regions of Pakistan during the 1980s. So there would be these refugee kids who would come across the border, and they would be recruited into these madrasas that the Saudis were funding, and they were getting military training because they were getting Quran and Kalashnikov. That's what these kids were getting for years. And in 1994, the trucking lobby in Pakistan approached Benazir Bhutto and said, "We want to do business with the with Turkmenistan, the Caspian oil-rich nation, but we can't get across Afghanistan because of all the chaos that's ensued after the Soviet withdrawal by the former Mujahideen." So the Minister of the Interior at that time, his name is Nasrullah Babar, like the elephant, the cartoon elephant, Babar the elephant. Nasrullah Babar was the former ISI chief, the former intelligence chief of Pakistan. At that time, he was Minister of the Interior. And he says to Benazir Bhutto, "Why don't we take these boys?" At this point, they're teenagers. They're like 20 years old, max 22 maybe. Why don't we give them new weapons and some Toyota pickup trucks, which the Saudis funded, and send them in to clean up the highway? And that's who the Taliban are. And that's who the Taliban still are. It's actually the same people today, the same people who committed atrocities in the 90s. The Biden administration wants people to believe that somehow the Taliban today are moderate and that they're different from the guys from the 1990s. They're the exact same people. And they're committing exactly the same crimes against humanity that they were committing in the 90s. They're committing the slaughter of Hazaras, which they were doing in Pakistan, by the way, while we were in Afghanistan and NATO was in Afghanistan. The Taliban was in Pakistan doing the bidding of ISI, perpetrating atrocities against the Pashtun people there. And now they're back in Afghanistan and committing atrocities against. And now there's a new rule in Afghanistan. Women can't even wear colored scarves. They're supposed to just be black blobs.
Melissa, we could definitely go on more about this, but I did want to also cover another topic. And we'll start with you and then we'll get Shervin's input. A lot of people are talking about a coming recession and growth in inflation. And I'm curious, do you think there's anything that the Congress should do going forward to help us when it comes to kind of the economic health of the country? And what's your sense of how the district is holding up right now?
The district is in devastation now. You drive along Ventura Boulevard and you see empty shop after empty shop after empty shop after empty shop. I mean, it's a retail graveyard. And A lot of this is because of the lockdowns. A lot of this is because of the increase in price of goods. A lot of that is because of the backlog at the port. And from Congress, we can help with that. So I understand that the backlog at the port was caused by a regulation that trucks over 3 years old couldn't get into the port to fill up. So it severely limited the number of trucks that could go in. And so it just brought everything down to a standstill. We can also resume gas drilling. I favor natural gas because it burns cleanly. It's just water vapor and carbon dioxide when it burns. So I think we need to go back to being energy independent, and that will lower fuel prices, and that will help to put a lid on inflation.
Thank you. Shervin, what are your thoughts?
I want to start by addressing the last comments from Melissa around energy. The United States is already the world's largest exporter of oil. And next year, we will become the world's largest exporter of LNG, or natural gas. So the production is already there. The problem is that here in our very own district, to say that respectfully, natural gas is cleaner, our district knows firsthand that it's not.
That's not true.
Just 6 years ago in Porter Ranch and Granada Hills, the Aliso Canyon blowout, 109,000 metric tons of methane dumped into the air, and thousands more polytoxic substances that the community is not even aware of because those environmental reports have not been released. And even after that blowout, when for over a 2-year period, we were not using that Aliso Canyon site and getting natural gas from other areas, despite that, you still had the California Public Utilities Commission in the fall of last year increase energy storage, even though the city was completely capable of doing without Aliso Canyon. Natural gas is not natural. It is not clean by any stretch of the imagination.
Methane
Wind
is
and
clean.
solar are actually clean. And in fact, the cost of production for wind and solar per kilowatt hour is lower than for coal and for natural gas. So if we're talking about fiscal responsibility, it's already cheaper, but we're not producing it at scale.
Except that with wind and solar, the creation of those batteries, all of that money is going out to China because China owns over 95% of all the rare earth element mines in the world, including in California. Although the good news is that there are a couple of investment groups trying to start up mines and mining operations in California for rare earth elements and lithium. We do have a rich source of those that we could use to increase solar and wind generation. But there are other ways of producing energy besides just wind and solar. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, the emphasis on wind and solar actually comes from a Chinese operation called the China Clean Development Mechanism Fund, which has been funding propaganda for wind and solar for years to the tune of $6 billion since about 2016. I think it's 2016. They've put $6 billion into promoting wind and solar as the only alternatives, when actually methane does burn cleanly, but the leak was the problem. So methane, everything emits methane. Dirt emits methane. You and I emit methane.
Right, but it's different scales. I mean, you can't compare those two things.
Right, but the leak was not burning, right? So the leak was a massive amount of methane released into the atmosphere without burning it, and that is a greenhouse gas.
Right.
Burning it is actually good for the environment because it diminishes its potential as a greenhouse gas.
That's simply not true. On the point of the state of California having a large source of lithium deposits, that's true. That area around the Salton Sea has been called the Saudi Arabia of lithium. But unfortunately, the current technology for mining lithium is very similar to the technology for fracking. And so there are a lot of concerns about polluting waterways, a lot of chemicals that are pumped deep into the ground to bring that lithium to the surface. My point here is that we can invest in our scientists, we can invest in our experts to come with cheaper, more efficient, renewable energies to be able to address our climate crisis, meet our energy needs, and create countless living wage jobs in the process.
So
but again, we're not doing it.
I
We're
actually
not
don't
doing it
believe we're
because
in a
it's not our
climate
interest.
crisis. I don't believe we're in a climate crisis. I know you're going to laugh, but again, that's the China Clean Development Mechanism Fund that's promoting this notion of the
So the
climate
raging
crisis.
wildfires, the severe storms we're seeing, the melting polar ice caps, the rising sea levels, that's all fake.
Wildfires are part of our natural ecology. There are species in California that only germinate when exposed to fire. Are you aware of this?
Yes, I am. But again, we're
Okay.
talking about scale.
Well,
a natural
no,
fire
not,
is very
but
different from corporate unaccountability and PGE started fires. There's a huge difference.
Yes, that PGE started fires, and there are people actually going around starting fires. So our climate is not hotter. You're not old enough to remember
Our climate,
the summer
the
of
amount of
1980.
carbon
I
in our
remember the
air
summer
has
of
passed
1980.
400 million metric tons. We have surpassed 1.2 degrees Celsius increase since the pre-industrial level.
Are you familiar with
the IPCC reports have made it clear that we are barreling towards climate catastrophe, and we have a short amount of time left to decarbonize our economy.
Are you familiar with the solar flare cycle, the Maunder cycle? 11 years up, 11 years down. We're actually on the downside. We're actually going down right now. I mean, where I am, it's cooler than it was last year.
We're comparing apples to oranges. You're citing data sets that are not actually addressing the root causes of these issues, which is that there's too much carbon in the air. We have too much greenhouse gas emissions that are trapping heat in our atmosphere, and it's leading to widespread famines, droughts. Climate change changes weather based on where you are.
All right, Shervin, let's let Melissa finish her point, and then we'll move on to another topic.
We don't actually have more carbon in the air. So when I moved to Los Angeles in 1993, our horizon was brown. In 2016, there was a study published showing that Los Angeles air quality in 2016 was 80% better than it was in 1980. We have great air quality now. Now, do we have the 6th worst air quality in the country? Well, we would probably have that if no one lived here because of inversion and because of the natural cycle of wildfires. But we do not have a problem with carbon in the atmosphere, and carbon dioxide is inhaled by every blade of grass, every tree, every bush. So you want more. So
you're
carbon
right.
dioxide
Trees,
in the
bush,
atmosphere, increased carbon dioxide actually improves food production. Because
not when we're cutting down forests at a faster rate than those trees are absorbing carbon. I mean, you look at the Amazon,
it's turned into a carbon
sink
down forests
because of deforestation. Again, this is global, right? We live in a rat cage. What you do on that end of the cage impacts the other end of the cage. You can't say because we're not cutting down trees here in LA, only doing it in the Amazon, it's not going to impact the entire world.
So that information about the Amazon is like 20 years old. It's not current information.
It's brand new.
Brazil stopped that years ago.
Not true.
They
All right. Well, let's just agree that you both have very different views on the climate crisis, or on the, sorry, not, I won't even put any color on the state of the climate. Okay. And we'll let voters decide on where they want to go. I did want to shift gears a little bit and talk about an open-ender, and we can start with you, Shervin, and then go to Melissa. What does success look like for you after your first term if you got into Congress?
It's a great question. So for us, success looks like, I'll start at the local level. Really creating as many opportunities to engage voters and get them more involved in civic engagement, to meet with the representatives, to provide policy trainings to our constituents, and to really use our office as a space to continue building this movement of getting people involved in our political system. and training folks in doing that work here locally, getting involved in better advocacy before our federal representatives, state and local. And then in terms of our success in Congress, the amount of bills I introduce addressing the top priorities for our district, whether it's healthcare, housing, climate, or other related issues. And not only introducing bills, but the amount of amendments I'm able to attach to important bills that, again, address the core issues for our constituents. The amount of bills we're able to get hearings on, get them out of committee, get them out of the House. The amount of times that I can work with counterparts in the Senate to introduce companion bills and move that through the process. That's how I gauge success, is how hard did I advocate to push the agenda of CA 32 residents forward in terms of bills introduced, bills passed, and then back to the district, engaging our voters and empowering them to get involved in our political system. That's how I gauge success.
Thanks, Shervin. Melissa, how would you measure success at the end of your
So
first term?
success for me would be UCLA off the VA and all of our homeless veterans living on their land again, and renovating and building more housing on that property that's strictly for veterans and preventing developers from taking it over. Success for me would be to see all of those empty retail spaces along Ventura Boulevard, on Magnolia, and all over the valley, to see it thriving again instead of looking at these dead commercial zones that we have now. Success to me is seeing the people living their lives, thriving. And it's not really about how many laws I pass. I was just telling somebody, just quoted at a meeting I was at, there's an old line that you can achieve a lot in this world if you're willing to give somebody else the credit. Mm-hmm. And I don't really care about the credit. I'm not looking for how many bills I passed. Even if I made something happen, I'm happy to give somebody else the credit, mm-hmm. just because I want to get that done so that it will help people's lives. That's my goal, is to bring Los Angeles back to life, because right now it's just tragic the way the city looks. It's heartbreaking for me.
Well, this feels like you both want the same things. Like, you want a district that's doing well, that's thriving, mm-hmm. And you have different ideas on how to get there, which is natural, and it's great. Shows the diversity of this district. My last question before we wrap up, and I know we're getting late into a Sunday night, is what do you want people to think about before they're marking their ballots on June 7th? And what message would you like to share with the voters in the 32nd District of California as they make their final decision? So, consider this an opportunity for you to make some closing remarks. And Melissa, we can start with you, and then we can go to Shervin.
So I want people, when they're marking their ballot, to look around, stop, think. Do they want more of the same, or do they want the problem solved? We didn't get really to the subject of the homeless. I have a very unique strategy for solving the homeless crisis, because nobody's talking about the fact that over half of our homeless are actually former inmates, and we only have a tiny... we have about 40,000 people living on our streets who used to be in prison, and only about 800 halfway house beds. We need more halfway houses, and I have a strategy for creating thousands of halfway house beds, tens of thousands, very quickly. And so if you want your neighborhood to be safe, because the homeless are being weaponized against us. Somebody wants us to all leave California, and it's working. Over 1 million Californians have left. So if you want your streets to be safer, if you want to see lower sanitation costs, lower law enforcement costs, because our law enforcement is trying to tackle the problem of the homeless right now, because they're committing crimes of survival in many cases. If you want to see lower correctional costs in the prison, then vote for Melissa Toomim because I have strategies to solve these problems. If you want more of the same, then, go that direction, but I certainly don't.
Thanks, Melissa. Shervin, closing thoughts from you.
Yeah, so I think that ensuring that no one's zip code dictates their ability to survive. We want to talk about high rates of socioeconomic related crime. Well, let's talk about the fact that people have stagnant wages, skyrocketing healthcare costs, skyrocketing housing costs, skyrocketing tuition costs, student loan debt, credit card debt, inability to afford basic expenses, whether it's childcare or food on the table. And so if we want to actually prevent crime, let's invest in our communities. Again, ensuring that no one's zip code dictates their ability to survive. Because homelessness is not a criminal justice issue. It's a humanitarian crisis. It's a failure of lack of housing and lack of ability to prevent homelessness by not addressing the economic pain that people are going through. I can't tell you how many Angelenos I've spoken with who said they are one missed paycheck or one emergency away from losing their home. And so we're not going to solve that through more incarceration and more militarized policing. Recognizing that, again, here in the city of LA, out of our $10 billion budget, over a third of that budget is already given to the LAPD. The police are not trained in addressing housing issues. Police are not trained in addressing mental health or substance use issues. We address those crises by employing more mental health counselors, more substance abuse counselors, by building more permanent supportive housing, by building more affordable housing, by addressing the fact that Wall Street corporate landlords like BlackRock and Blackstone have decimated our housing market. How Congress opened the floodgates for those firms to swoop in after the recession, buy apartment complexes, buy foreclosed homes for pennies on the dollar, flip them, and through through speculative trading, increase those costs. And who foots the bill? Us. And so addressing that corporate greed in our system by finally having an unapologetic advocate who's not beholden to their corporate donors, but is beholden to constituents. That's a kind of representation we deserve, again, in a safely democratic district like ours that voted for Bernie Sanders in the 2020 presidential primary overwhelmingly. We deserve an unapologetic advocate who's not going to bow down to corporate interests, who's not going to bow down to the establishment in both parties, but actually speak truth to power and take power and bring it back into the hands of low-income, working-class, middle-class Angelenos. That's how we ensure, again, that here in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, where our budgets are moral documents, that we deserve representatives who are fighting to invest those budgets in us. Not in corporate bailouts, not in endless wars, but back into our communities.
Well, thank you, Shervin and Melissa. I want to acknowledge that you both took the time out to talk about really complex issues, and you did it in a very respectful way, even though you disagreed on a lot of things, which is expected and great. And hopefully folks out there who are watching this live or on replay, if you want to know more about CA32 candidates, this conversation, hopefully it's helpful. Go check out Shervin and Melissa's respective websites to learn more about their views and their policies. And I'll probably reflect more, and I'll be making an endorsement from the Nerds for Humanity podcast for this district. If anybody is running and wasn't able to join us tonight for scheduling reasons, they're welcome to reach out to me, tom@nerdsforhumanity.com. Just email me, and we'll schedule a time, and I'll give you some a venue to discuss. And then, if we can talk in the next few days, I'll probably make an endorsement announcement this weekend. So like a week from now, I guess next weekend, and just in time for June 7th. But any final remarks or calls to action, or for people who want to, oh yeah, go ahead, Melissa.
Well, I just wanted two things about what Shervin was saying. And Shervin, I really have a lot of respect for you. So he's right about the toxic nature of Blackstone and BlackRock on our economy. And those are some of Brad Sherman's biggest donors. They own him. However, I disagree with you on the notion that we can build our way out with, quote, affordable housing. I feel like, I don't just feel like, I know from looking at the documents that affordable housing is just a boondoggle for developers. We cannot build our way out of this. It just attracts more people who want to come here and go, oh, you know, I'll just come to the sunshine, I'll live at the beach, and oh, look, they're going to give me an apartment. That won't solve anything. The need to get former inmates off the street and get former foster kids off the street, which is 30%. So just those two cohorts, that's 80% of our homeless. And we can help them rebuild their lives with the former inmates, and we can help the foster kids with, so COVID's given us an opportunity in two ways. People aren't going back to work in offices. They're working remotely, as we are doing right now. And kids aren't going off to college as much. So we have empty office buildings, and we have a lot of empty dormitory space. We can put those foster kids in dormitories and give them scholarships so that they have the tools to succeed in life. And we can use the empty office buildings for halfway houses. All we need to do is plug it, install some showers, plug in some new appliances, and all of the other tools that are needed to help these former inmates rebuild their lives and become productive citizens are right there.
Shervin, I'll let you respond since Melissa referenced your position.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One thing that's important on affordable housing, I agree with Melissa that those resources are going into the pockets of real estate developers, not actually putting shovel to dirt. And I've said multiple times, there's way too much bureaucratic red tape, way too many hands that money goes to from the assessor to the developer before shovel hits dirt. So I believe we need more municipal public social housing and investments in that. Again, we talked earlier about repealing the Faircloth Amendment. And on the topic of having a lot of formerly incarcerated folks that are unhoused, you're absolutely right. And again, that goes back to our policies. When we've privatized the parole system and people are paying so much money for the parole fees, when there is discrimination baked into our system, where if you are formerly incarcerated, you face discrimination in housing, you face discrimination in employment, you face discrimination in education. Well, those barriers are keeping our communities down, and they're disproportionately impacting.
It's how the homeless are being weaponized against us so that we'll leave, which is another reason we don't need to build affordable housing, because over 1 million Californians have already left. So they didn't take their houses and apartments with them, right? We actually have a housing glut, and nobody's admitting it.
So you're saying that we have homes that are way too expensive. We're building more apartment complexes.
Building
luxury apartment complexes.
Yeah, they're charging $1 million a unit.
And again, that's because the developers are the ones that control the way our city council operates, and are the ones that work with Congress. I mean, again, you said it yourself. Brad Sherman, he's taken $5 million combined from the real estate, securities, and investment industry. And so, of course, he's not going to stand there and say we need to invest in more housing.
Blackstone, Vanguard, right. Fidelity,
right.
and Berkshire Hathaway,
right.
And those are the same companies that are engineering the theft of our veterans' land.
Yep. Yeah, 2/3 of LA apartment complexes are owned by institutional investors. If you're trying to buy a home right now, you're competing with someone's pension fund.
Yeah,
you're competing with some corporate landlord.
It's not a lack of housing. Yep. Again, it's not a lack of housing. It's a lack of access.
Access is absolutely integral to solving the problem, but it's also we need to build more housing. We need to build more permanent supportive housing. You said it yourself. And this is not exactly housing, but we have over 40,000.
I said converting office buildings that are sitting there empty.
I agree with you.
Halfway houses.
I agree with you. We also have abandoned schools.
That's transitional. That's transitional. That's a period of like 6 months to a year.
We can build
former inmates to go in and get life skills and have a place to stay.
Yeah.
And get where they get job placement so they can build a resume and work their way up into a place, being able to afford an apartment or afford, a room in somebody else's apartment.
I'm all for converting those abandoned buildings, whether it's municipal buildings or private buildings, converting them into permanent supportive housing, which is what you're talking about. Because those sheds,
that's
those
not,
sheds that
because
we're
I'm saying
seeing,
we should just lease them. I said we should just lease them because the county already has over 1,300 empty buildings that it owns. So we can convert some of those buildings, and I've
Right.
already ordered a list of those buildings, which I'm getting ready to start studying, so I can figure out which ones can be converted to halfway houses, transitional housing, again, not permanent supportive housing, but transitional housing. Well, do you mean by permanent, permanently owned by the government? What do you mean by permanent?
publicly owned, correct.
Okay. So, like I said, those buildings are already owned by the county.
And we can convert them to permanent
And
supportive
I think
housing.
the other buildings, the office buildings, I suggest we just lease, so that, because what happens is, as you reduce this population, right now, the population is being nurtured into growth, right? When people get out of prison, they're given $200, a ride into town, and they're dumped on the sidewalk. If they don't have family to go home to, they're homeless right away. And they're committing crimes for survival. They're getting into drugs and alcohol, committing crimes there, and committing crimes to go back to prison where it's safe, right? So this is a self-generating, self-perpetuating and building problem. Whereas if we take, if the next group of people who get out of prison go straight into halfway houses, a large percentage of those people will go on to productive lives. There will always be a criminal element, but it won't be a burgeoning problem, which it is now. And so the need for halfway houses will diminish over time.
So I think, and on our housing platform, is creating a new federal housing program for the formerly incarcerated. So I agree it's a huge issue. We have too many unhoused folks who are either veterans, to your point, or are formerly incarcerated. But again, building more sheds, building more shelters that are transitional, that are impermanent by definition. Why are we putting our resources into stopgap measures?
I'm not saying shelters or sheds.
Again, permanent, just to define it, permanent supportive housing is that permanent roof over your head integrated with those essential medical services, employment services, mental health services, substance use services.
And all of those can be in those office buildings.
They're built in. That's what permanent supportive housing is.
Saying we lease the buildings, say we lease them on a 5 or a 10-year lease, and we don't buy them outright.
Mm-hmm.
We have, because like I said, the need for them will go down over time because they will be effective.
Sure.
So we won't have as many people feeding into the prison system, and we won't have the prison system feeding into the homeless population. But if they're leased, then at some point the owner of that building can go, well, I want the building back. You're hardly using it anymore, so I'm going to do XYZ with it now. And then that's not one more empty property on the government rolls. I mean, the county doesn't even really know how many properties it has right now. Mm-hmm. 1,300 is just the number they know about.
Well, we could go on for a lot longer, but I feel like we've definitely given the audience and potential voters another vector to kind of think about as they make their decision on who to vote for in this first election on June 7th. And again, really appreciate both of you coming on, speaking at length, and willing to hear other views and advocate for your positions. So folks, if you're listening to this live or on replay, share it out, let people know, encourage anyone you know in the district to do their research and get to know every candidate as well as they can. And I want to thank both you, Shervin and Melissa, again for coming on. It's been a really fun conversation, and best of luck to you on the 7th.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Melissa. It was great meeting you.
Great meeting you too, Shervin, and thank you so much for inviting me, Tom. Y'all have a good night.
Take
Good
care.
night. We'll ask one last thing of both of you. Can I get a goodbye, nerds, from each of you? Goodbye, nerds.
Melissa, after you.
Oh, God. Goodbye, nerds. Mwah.
Goodbye, nerds.
Love it. You guys are great. Thank you.